The Man Who Lit Up the World, The Extraordinary Life of Thomas Alva Edison. Chapter 1. A Boy Too Curious for His Own Good. Let's start at the beginning. February 11th, 1847. Milan, Ohio. A small town so unremarkable that even people from Ohio have trouble finding it on a map. Into this quiet, frozen corner of the world, a baby arrived. His name was Thomas Alva Edison, and from the very first moment, the universe seemed to be preparing something unusual. Thomas was the seventh child of Samuel and Nancy Edison, 7 children. If that sounds exhausting, it's because it was. But Thomas, or Al, as his family called him, was something else entirely. While other children played with toys and chased chickens, young Al was staring at things, studying them, poking them, wondering what would happen if he did something absolutely inadvisable to them. By the time he was 6 years old, he had already tried to hatch goose eggs by sitting on them himself, reasoning that if a goose could do it, why couldn't he? The answer, as it turned out, involved a lot of cold mud and wounded dignity. He also reportedly set his father's barn on fire just to see what would happen. What happened was a very angry father and a very public spanking in the town square. Sam Edison believed in lessons being learned publicly. Thomas Edison believed the barn had been quite informative. Thank you very much. His mother, Nancy, was a former school teacher, and she was the one who truly understood her peculiar son. When Thomas was 7, the family moved to Port Huron, Michigan. He was enrolled in school, and almost immediately, things went sideways. His teacher, a Reverend Engel, described young Thomas as addled, a polite Victorian way of saying his brain was operating on a frequency nobody else could tune into. After just 12 weeks of formal schooling, Nancy had heard enough. She marched down to that school, informed the teacher exactly what she thought of his assessment, and pulled Thomas out permanently. She would homeschool him herself, and in doing so, she may have accidentally saved the future of electricity, motion pictures, recorded sound, and about 1,000 other things you use every day without thinking about. Nancy gave Thomas books. Not children's books, real books, history, science, philosophy. Thomas devoured them like a starving man at a buffet. By age 9, he was reading serious scientific texts. By 10, he had built his own chemistry laboratory in the basement, filled with over 200 bottles of chemicals, each carefully labeled with the word poison, so his brothers and sisters wouldn't touch them. Whether or not they were all actually poisonous was somewhat beside the point. The label worked. Here was a child who couldn't sit still in a classroom, couldn't follow instructions that bored him, couldn't memorize things that seemed pointless. But give him a problem, give him a mystery, give him something that didn't work yet, and he would not stop until he understood it completely. He was, in modern terms, a kid with a wildly unconventional learning style and an intellect that simply refused to be contained by 4 walls and a chalkboard. The universe, it seems, had plans. Chapter 2. The Teenage Entrepreneur, and The Incident with the Train. At 12 years old, Thomas Edison became a working man. He got a job selling newspapers and candy on the Grand Trunk Railway, running between Port Huron and Detroit. Every day he'd ride the train into Detroit, sell his goods, and ride back. But Thomas Edison couldn't just sell newspapers. That would be far too simple. He convinced the railway officials to let him use an empty baggage car as a laboratory. He set up his chemicals and equipment right there on the moving train, conducting experiments between stops. He also bought a small printing press, hired a friend to help him, and started publishing his own newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald, which he printed on the train and sold to passengers. At 12 years old. The boy was running a mobile science lab and a media company simultaneously, from a train. Then one day, a stick of phosphorus rolled off a shelf and set the baggage car on fire. The conductor, a man named Alexander Stevenson, was not amused. He reportedly grabbed young Thomas by the ears and threw him, along with his printing press and his chemicals, off the train at the next stop. According to Edison's own account, this was also the moment his hearing began to fail, though historians debate whether the ear-grabbing or a bout of scarlet fever was truly to blame. Either way, Thomas Edison was now partially deaf. And here's where the story gets interesting, because Thomas Edison never once, not for a single day of his life, treated his deafness as a disability. He called it a gift. The deafness, he said later, probably saved me from distraction. While the rest of the world was buzzing with noise, Thomas could retreat into the cathedral of his own mind and think, and think, and think some more. Around this time, a remarkable thing happened. A station master named J.U. Mackenzie had a young son who wandered onto the tracks in front of an oncoming freight car. Thomas, who happened to be nearby, threw down what he was carrying and sprinted. He snatched the boy off the tracks just seconds before the train roared through. The station master, overwhelmed with gratitude, offered to teach Thomas telegraphy as a thank you. Thomas said yes before the man had finished the sentence. Within weeks he was proficient. Within months he was exceptional. The telegraph was the internet of the 1860s, an almost magical system of clicking dots and dashes that could send messages across vast distances at something approaching the speed of thought. Thomas became a telegraph operator, and for the next several years he wandered from city to city, working telegraph offices across the Midwest and South, earning just enough to get by, spending everything he had on scientific journals and electrical equipment. He was a terrible employee. Not because he was lazy. He was the opposite of lazy, but because he couldn't stop tinkering. He was supposed to be operating the telegraph. Instead, he was improving it, modifying it, staying up all night running experiments, falling asleep at his station, and occasionally flooding the office with sulfuric acid when an experiment went wrong. He got fired more than once. He got fired with a frequency that would have demoralized most people. Thomas Edison found it educational. Chapter 3: New York, Failure, and the First Spark of Genius. By 1868, Edison was 21 years old, broke, and living in Boston. He had exactly two things going for him: a mind that never stopped working, and a total inability to recognize when he was supposed to give up. He filed his first patent that year, a vote recording machine. It was brilliant. It worked perfectly. It would have made legislative voting dramatically faster and more efficient, and nobody wanted it. Politicians, it turned out, didn't actually want voting to be faster. They used the slow counting process to negotiate and politic in the background. A machine that counted instantly would ruin everything. Edison was furious, then philosophical. He made himself a promise. He would never again invent something nobody wanted. From that point on, he would start with the need and work backward to the invention. A lesson worth remembering, honestly. In 1869, he arrived in New York City, nearly penniless, having talked his way into sleeping in the basement of a company called the Law's Gold Indicator Company while he figured out his next move. The very day he arrived, the company's telegraph system, which broadcast gold prices to trading houses across the city, broke down completely. Chaos erupted. The superintendent was frantic. Edison calmly looked at the machine, spotted the problem in minutes, and fixed it. He was offered a job on the spot at a salary 3 times what he'd been earning. New York City had met Thomas Edison. New York City did not know what had hit it. He was off. Within a year, he had sold an improved stock ticker to Western Union for the astounding sum of $40,000. He stared at the check for a long time. Then he went and opened a workshop in Newark, New Jersey, hired 50 employees, and started inventing things with the focused intensity of a man who has just discovered what he was born to do. The Newark years were a whirlwind. Telegraphs, printers, multiple patents, multiple companies. He was simultaneously running several projects, mentoring young engineers, managing workers, and still doing a lot of the hands-on experimental work himself. He rarely slept more than 4 or 5 hours. He lived on cigars, apple pie, and whatever was available when someone remembered to bring him food. He was chaotic. He was difficult. He was also producing results that nobody else in the world was producing. But he hadn't yet found his stage. Chapter 4: Menlo Park, the Invention Factory. In 1876, Edison did something nobody had ever done before. He didn't just invent a thing. He invented a place for inventing things. He moved to a small patch of farmland in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and built what he called an invention factory. A proper laboratory, large, well-equipped, staffed with talented engineers, machinists, and scientists, designed with one explicit purpose: to produce a major invention every 10 days and a big one every 6 months. He announced this goal publicly, with the confidence of a man who either knows something nobody else knows or is about to embarrass himself spectacularly on a national stage. He was not embarrassed. The team he assembled at Menlo Park was extraordinary. Charles Batchelor, a meticulous English engineer who could translate Edison's wild ideas into working prototypes. John Crucy, a Swiss machinist of almost supernatural skill. Charles Burt Clark, Francis Upton, and dozens of others, a diverse, brilliant, slightly exhausted group of men who referred to themselves, with a mixture of pride and self-pity, as the boys. The culture Edison built was unusual. There were no fixed hours. There were no clean divisions between working time and not working time. When something was close, when they were nearly there, they would work through the night, multiple nights, sustained by terrible food, terrible coffee, off-key singing, and the electric feeling that they were on the edge of something extraordinary. Edison himself would lie down on a workbench and sleep for a few hours, then wake up and keep going as if nothing had happened. The man seemed to run on a different fuel than ordinary humans. And then, in 1877, Thomas Edison invented something that genuinely shocked the world. He invented the phonograph. The idea was almost embarrassingly simple in retrospect. Sound creates vibrations. Vibrations can be recorded as physical impressions on a surface. Those impressions can then be played back to recreate the sound. Edison designed a machine with a rotating cylinder wrapped in tinfoil, a needle, and a diaphragm. He handed the design to John Crucy to build, apparently without explaining what it was for. When Crucy handed it back, Edison leaned in, turned the crank, spoke into the machine. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and then repositioned the needle at the start and played it back. The room went completely silent. Then it erupted. His own voice, coming out of a machine, his own words, preserved. Nobody in human history had ever heard their own voice played back to them. It was, by any measure, one of the most astonishing moments in the history of technology. The press called it a miracle. Scientific American devoted multiple columns to it. People came from across the country to see and hear the talking machine. Edison was celebrated, feted, praised. President Hayes invited him to the White House. He demonstrated the phonograph at 2 a.m. for an excited Hayes and his wife, who apparently didn't mind the hour at all. Thomas Edison, the kid who'd been thrown off a train, fired repeatedly, dismissed as addled, was, at 30 years old, the most famous inventor in the world, and he was just getting started. Chapter 5. Let there be light. Here's something easy to take for granted. For almost all of human history, when the sun went down, the world went dark. You could have candles, you could have gas lamps, which were expensive, smelly, and genuinely dangerous. Gas lighting caused regular fires and explosions, and the flickering, inconsistent light was brutal on the eyes. Darkness was not just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental constraint on human life. The workday ended when the light ended. By the late 1870s, the idea of electric light was floating around. Arc lamps existed, burning brilliantly but far too harshly for home or office use. What was needed was something incandescent, a gentle, sustained glow from a filament. Other inventors were chasing this. The British inventor Joseph Swan was working on it. Several others were circling the problem. Everyone agreed electric light was coming. Nobody could quite get it to work. Edison announced, in September 1878, that he had solved the problem. He told the newspapers this with complete confidence. There was only one issue. He hadn't actually solved it yet. Not even close. He was doing something that was either visionary or insane, announcing success to generate investor interest, then using that investment to actually achieve the success. It was, depending on your perspective, either brilliant strategy or audacious fraud. History has been kind to him, largely because it worked. What followed was 14 months of some of the most intense, grueling work in the history of invention. The problem was the filament. For an incandescent bulb to work, you needed a material that could glow white-hot without immediately burning up. Edison tested everything he could think of: platinum, various metal alloys, carbon in different forms, every conceivable approach. The team ran thousands of experiments. They got close, then failed. Got closer, failed again. Each failure was logged, documented, and analyzed because Edison had a philosophy about failure that sustained him through all of it. I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. He meant this. He genuinely meant this. To Edison, a failed experiment wasn't a defeat. It was information. The universe was telling him something. He just had to listen carefully enough. In October 1879, after testing carbonized bamboo and various other carbon filaments, they arrived at a carbonized cotton thread. It went into a glass bulb. The air was pumped out. The electricity went on. It glowed, not for a second, not for a minute, for 13.5 hours. Edison is said to have watched it for most of that time, barely moving, barely speaking, just watching. Then he started improving. Within weeks, they had filaments lasting hundreds of hours. On December 31st, 1879, Edison threw open Menlo Park to the public and illuminated the entire complex with electric light. Hundreds of people came out in the cold winter night to see it. They stood in the glow of something that had never existed in the world before, and many of them wept. Think about that for a moment. They wept because they could see in the dark. Chapter 6. Building the world. Literally. Inventing the light bulb was, if you can believe it, the easier part. The harder part was making it matter. Building an entire electrical infrastructure that would deliver electricity to homes and businesses across cities. Edison didn't just invent a light bulb. He invented a complete electrical system, dynamos to generate the electricity, cables to carry it, junction boxes, meters, switches, sockets, all of it. He thought of it like a gas lighting system, but for electricity, and designed it with the practical reality of everyday use in mind. Every single component had to be invented, designed, manufactured, and installed. He set up the Edison Electric Illuminating Company of New York and decided to electrify Lower Manhattan as his demonstration project. He built a generating station at 257 Pearl Street, managed the installation of miles of underground cables through the streets of Manhattan, convinced banks and businesses to let him wire their buildings, and on September 4th, 1882, he flipped the switch. The lights came on across Lower Manhattan. Offices lit up. The New York Times reported the event with barely contained astonishment. The age of electrical power had begun. Over the following years, Edison threw himself into the business of electricity with the same relentless energy he'd brought to invention. He built companies, licensed his technology, and expanded electrical service across the country and into Europe. He became extraordinarily wealthy. He built a new and grander laboratory at West Orange, New Jersey, 5 buildings, hundreds of employees, a library of 10,000 volumes. It was the most complete private research facility in the world. He also, around this time, made one of the great strategic errors in business history. He chose direct current. We'll come back to that. Chapter 7. Love, Loss, and the Persistence of a Man. In the middle of all this invention and business building, Thomas Edison had a personal life, though he sometimes seemed to forget about it. He had married Mary Stilwell in 1871 when he was 24 and she was 16. They had 3 children together, whom he nicknamed with characteristic Edison whimsy, Marion, nicknamed Dot, Thomas Jr., nicknamed Dash, and William. He loved his family, in the distracted, absent-minded way of a man who was almost always somewhere else in his head, even when he was physically present. Mary complained, not without reason, that he spent more time with his machines than with her. She was not wrong. During the critical periods of the light bulb experiments, Edison sometimes slept at the laboratory for days at a time. His dedication to his work was total, and the things that suffered were the things that couldn't compete with the magnetic pull of a problem not yet solved. In August 1884, Mary Edison died. She was 29 years old. The cause was likely a brain tumor, though the records of the time are imprecise. Edison was devastated, genuinely, deeply devastated. Whatever his failings as a present husband, he had loved her. He was found sitting beside her body in the dark, head in his hands, crying. For a man famous for saying that he had never done a day's work in his life because he loved what he did, this was the closest he came to complete stillness, complete silence. He threw himself back into work. What else could he do? 2 years later, at a friend's home, he met Mina Miller. She was 20 years old, the daughter of a wealthy Ohio industrialist, educated, beautiful, and possessed of a calm, gracious intelligence that was the perfect counterweight to Edison's explosive restlessness. He was enchanted. He taught her Morse code so they could tap messages to each other in secret at social gatherings, tapping out his marriage proposal on the palm of her hand, which is either the most romantic or most eccentric proposal in history, depending on your sensibility. She said yes. He built her a grand estate in West Orange, New Jersey, Glenmont, and they were married in February 1886. They had 3 children, Madeline, Charles, and Theodore. Mina proved to be not just a devoted wife, but an effective manager of Edison's chaotic personal life, organizing his schedule, managing their social obligations, gently but firmly ensuring that the great inventor occasionally ate meals and slept in a bed. Edison loved her without reservation and said so, repeatedly, publicly, for the rest of his life. "She deserves a better husband than me," he once told a friend, "but she won't get one who tries harder." Chapter 8. The War of the Currents. Now, the Great Embarrassment. By the late 1880s, a young Serbian genius named Nikola Tesla was working for Edison. Tesla had immigrated to America with almost nothing, carrying a recommendation letter that said, essentially, "I know of only 2 great men in the world, and this is one of them." Tesla was a visionary of the highest order, mathematical, precise, deeply strange, a man who claimed to see his inventions fully formed in his mind before he built them. Tesla believed in alternating current, AC electricity, which could be transmitted over much longer distances than Edison's direct current, DC. He tried to convince Edison. Edison refused to listen. He had built his entire empire on DC infrastructure. He wasn't interested in having a young employee tell him it was the wrong approach. He dismissed Tesla's ideas, reportedly promised him a large bonus for solving certain engineering problems, and then claimed it was a joke when Tesla solved them. Tesla quit. He went to work for George Westinghouse, who understood exactly what AC electricity could do, and the War of the Currents began. Edison's response to AC competition is one of the least flattering chapters of his life, and we should be honest about it. He mounted a public campaign against AC electricity, arguing it was deadly. To prove this, he, and this is real, this actually happened, began publicly electrocuting animals with AC current, stray dogs, calves, a circus elephant named Topsy, though that was slightly later and more complicated. He was trying to associate AC electricity with death in the public mind. He even lobbied, successfully, to have the first electric chair use AC current so that execution by electricity would become known as being Westinghoused. It was ugly, it was dishonest, and it didn't work. A C won. It was simply better technology for transmitting power over long distances, and no amount of dead animals could change the laws of physics. Westinghouse won the contract to illuminate the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, powered the whole thing with AC electricity, and that was essentially the end of the debate. Edison eventually, quietly, incorporated AC into his own operations. He never quite admitted he'd been wrong about it. He was a great man, and great men sometimes find it difficult to say those words. The War of the Currents cost Edison financially and reputationally, but it did not slow him down. Chapter 9. Motion, Sound, and the Birth of Entertainment. Edison's West Orange laboratory was, if anything, more productive than Menlo Park. In 1888, he threw himself into improving the phonograph, turning it from a novelty into a practical commercial product. He also worked on something extraordinary, a device to do for the eyes what the phonograph did for the ears, a machine to capture and replay moving images. The result was the kinetoscope, a peephole viewer that allowed one person at a time to watch a short film. Edison's team, particularly his brilliant assistant W.K.L. Dixon, developed both the camera and the viewer. They filmed everything: boxing matches, trained animals, vaudeville acts, workers dancing at the lab. One of the most significant of these early films was Fred Ott's Sneeze, 45 frames of a man sneezing, shot in 1894. It is the oldest surviving motion picture in the world. Humanity's first movie was a sneeze. There is something deeply appropriate about that. The kinetoscope parlors were an immediate sensation. People lined up and paid to peer into the machines and watch 30 seconds of moving pictures. It was magic. It was impossible. It was happening. Edison, however, made a decision that is still argued about. He didn't think the public would be very interested in projecting films for large audiences. He thought the individual viewer experience was the future. He declined to develop a proper film projector with sufficient speed. This allowed others, most notably the Lumière brothers in France, to race ahead with projection technology. By 1896, Edison was playing catch-up, licensing and then acquiring projection technology to stay relevant. He entered the film business in a big way and promptly became one of the most aggressive monopolists in its history. He formed the Motion Picture Patents Company, known by critics as the Edison Trust, which attempted to control every aspect of the American film industry through patent law. Independent filmmakers were harassed, sued, and intimidated. Many of them fled to the far edge of the country, to a sunny, remote place called Hollywood, to escape Edison's lawyers and his enforcers. The film industry as it exists today, in Los Angeles, not New York, owes its geography in part to people running away from Thomas Edison. He lost this battle, too, eventually, when the courts broke up his trust in 1915. But by then, he had already made enormous contributions to motion pictures, recorded sound, and the business of entertainment. The world of movies, for better and worse, has his fingerprints all over it. Chapter 10. The Iron Mine, the Concrete House, and the Beautiful Failures. Not every Edison venture was successful, not by a long stretch. And this is important to understand, because the story of Edison is not just a story of triumph. It's a story of obsessive, costly, sometimes catastrophic failure, sustained by a belief in eventual success so absolute it bordered on delusion. In the 1890s, Edison became convinced that he could solve the problem of low-grade iron ore by developing a system to magnetically separate iron from crushed rock. He sank millions of dollars, essentially his entire fortune from the phonograph business, into an iron mining and processing operation in New Jersey. It was a massive, complex operation involving enormous machines, continuous challenges with ore quality and processing efficiency, and years of relentless problem-solving. And then the iron ore market collapsed, and high-grade ore was discovered in Minnesota, which could be mined far more cheaply. The enterprise failed completely. Edison lost everything he had put into it, which was substantial. His response? He laughed. Genuinely laughed. "Well," he said, "it's all gone, but we had a hell of a good time spending it." Then he noticed that the techniques he'd developed for crushing ore could be applied to producing Portland cement. He pivoted. He built a cement company, developed innovative kiln technology, and produced cement used in large construction projects, including, interestingly, the original Yankee Stadium. He then became convinced that the future of housing was in concrete, preformed concrete houses, poured in a single operation using elaborate molds that would be affordable and long-lasting. He spent years developing the molds and the process. The concrete house idea was, to put it gently, ahead of its time in ways that made it impractical, and it never caught on. But it was typical Edison, swinging big, thinking in systems, occasionally missing. He also spent years, starting around 1910, trying to develop an efficient electrical storage battery for use in electric cars and industrial applications. He was convinced the lead-acid battery was inadequate and that an alkaline battery could be far superior. He worked on this for nearly a decade, running tens of thousands of experiments, and eventually produced a nickel-iron battery that was genuinely excellent, durable, long-lasting, effective. By the time it was perfected, however, the gasoline-powered automobile had swept the market. His battery found use in submarines, railroads, and other industrial applications, but not in the mass-market electric car revolution he'd imagined. He was, as it turns out, about a century early on that one. The world eventually caught up. Chapter 11. The Old Wizard and the Last Great Quest. By the 1920s, Thomas Edison was in his 70s, and famous in a way that very few human beings have ever been famous. He was a symbol of American ingenuity, of the self-made man, of the triumph of hard work and imagination over every obstacle. Presidents sought his opinions. Newspapers treated his comments on any subject as front-page news. Children wrote him letters. He received so much mail that he had to hire a team just to manage it. He was also, beneath the monument, still just Tom Edison. Still curious, still restless, still unable to walk past an interesting problem without stopping to poke at it. In 1927, he formed a research partnership with two men who were also, in their different ways, legends of American industry. Henry Ford, who had revolutionized manufacturing, and Harvey Firestone, the tire magnate. Their friendship was one of the more unlikely and charming things in the history of American business. Three old giants, camping together in the summers, wandering the woods, debating, joking, exploring. Their shared project was a search for a domestic source of rubber. The United States was dependent on imported rubber, which seemed strategically dangerous. Edison, at 80 years old, threw himself into botanical research with the same ferocious energy he'd brought to the light bulb 50 years earlier. He and his team tested thousands of plants, over 14,000 varieties, looking for one that could produce rubber in commercial quantities efficiently. He found a promising candidate in goldenrod, a common wildflower, and through selective breeding developed a strain that could produce reasonable rubber yields. It was not a perfect solution, but it was remarkable work, and it pointed in useful directions that synthetic rubber research would later follow. He was still working on this project when his health began to fail seriously in 1931. Diabetes and kidney disease were advancing. He spent more time at his Florida winter home in Fort Myers, resting. Though resting for Edison still meant reading and thinking and occasionally waving at boats from his dock. He told a friend that one of his greatest regrets was not having time to follow all the trails he could see. There were so many interesting problems still unsolved, so many things still to understand. He did not seem frightened of death exactly, but he seemed impatient with it, annoyed at the interruption. On October 18, 1931, Thomas Alva Edison died peacefully at his home in West Orange, New Jersey. He was 84 years old. The tributes that poured in were extraordinary. The great and the humble, the powerful and the ordinary, from across America and around the world. President Hoover led the mourning. Henry Ford was so overcome that he reportedly asked that a test tube of air from the room be captured at the moment of Edison's death, and that test tube sits in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan to this day. Make of that what you will. On the night of his funeral, the President of the United States asked Americans to dim their electric lights for 1 minute in tribute, and across the country, in homes and businesses and streets lit by the very technology that Edison had given the world, people reached up and clicked off their lights and stood for a moment in the dark. Then they turned them back on. Chapter 12. The Legacy of a Man Who Refused to Stop. So what do we make of Thomas Edison? He held 1,093 patents, still a record. He invented or perfected the phonograph, the incandescent light bulb, the electrical power distribution system, the motion picture camera, the alkaline storage battery, the carbon microphone, the fluoroscope, and dozens of other devices. He built the world's first industrial research laboratory, essentially inventing the concept of organized research and development that every technology company in the world operates on today. He created industries, the recorded music industry, the film industry, the electrical utility industry, that now employ millions of people and generate trillions of dollars. He also cut corners. He took credit, sometimes more than was strictly his due, from the contributions of his team. He fought dirty in the war of the currents. He could be a difficult, demanding, and sometimes infuriating employer. He was a better inventor than he was a businessman, a better thinker than he was a listener, a better visionary than he was a father. He was complicated, as all interesting people are complicated, but what strikes you most when you read through the life of Thomas Edison is not the inventions. It's the attitude, the sheer stubbornness of the man, the refusal to accept that a thing couldn't be done just because it hadn't been done yet, the willingness to fail, publicly and expensively and repeatedly, and get back up and try again. The belief, not as a piece of motivational rhetoric, but as a practical operating principle, that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He tested 30,000 different theories in developing the alkaline battery. 30,000. Most people give up after one failed attempt and spend the rest of their lives calling the thing impossible. Edison just kept a notebook. He lived as he worked at full speed. He wrung every possible drop out of every day. He was curious about everything, passionate about learning, delighted by the strange and the unexpected. He found joy in problems. He found meaning in work. He found, in the end, that a life devoted to understanding how the world works and then making it work a little better is about as good a life as a person can have. The addled boy from Milan, Ohio, the one who couldn't sit still in school, who set barns on fire and blew up chemistry sets and got thrown off trains, he lit up the world. He put music in a box and stories on a screen. He took the darkness that had constrained human life since the beginning of time, and he said simply, "Not anymore. The lights are still on." And that's the story of Thomas Alva Edison, the addled boy who lit up the world. If this journey moved you, if it made you laugh, or think, or see your own struggles a little differently, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because Edison is just the beginning. We have giants waiting, people who changed history, broke every rule, and refused to quit. You don't want to arrive late to those stories. Drop a comment below. Tell me which world giant you want to hear about next. I read every single one. See you on the next one.